Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director here at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC. And we want to thank you for coming out today. There's some lovely music. It's kind of peaceful for me. That's great. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento. And the team from the Higher Education Center has just released a new report titled, "What Happens When Colleges Broaden Access to Transfer-Level Courses? Evidence from California Community Colleges," authored by Marisol Cuellar Mejia, Olga Rodriguez, Hans Johnson, and research support from Sergio Sanchez and Bonnie Brooks, all of who are here today. So we want to thank them for their work. We'd like to thank the California Accelerator. Oops, sorry, did I change something? So sorry. We'll figure that out. We'd like to also thank the California Acceleration Project and the Sutton Family Fund for their support of this work, and an additional thank you to the Sutton Family Fund for making this lunch possible. You have received a copy of the report on your chair, and there are additional copies at the registration desk. The report, the technical appendix, which has all the really fun data, is available, and the slides from today's presentation are now available at ppic.org. For today's program, we're going to first hear from Marisol, who will present the main findings from the report, and then from Hans Johnson, who will moderate a discussion for a fantastic panel of experts. Olga was going to be here, but she's sick today, so Olga, if you're watching, we hope you feel better. And finally, we should have plenty of time for audience question and answers. You should have received an agenda on your chair, and all the speakers' bios are on the back side, so in the interest of time, we'll only do brief introductions today. And please note, we'll also have an online audience, so when you ask your questions, please wait for the microphones during the question and answer. A few things before we get started. We have a few upcoming events on our website. The topics and dates are Poverty and Opportunity in California on October 15th. We have an Improving Education Opportunity in California on October 25th. And finally, our annual Water Policy Conference, Preparing California Water System for Climate Extremes, will take place on November 5th. All of those will include lunch. Not that's why you come, but it's a nice side effect. More details and registration is available online. And later today, as always, you'll receive a survey, and we do appreciate your responses on those surveys. And lastly, please turn off your cell phones. In 2018, AB 705 by Assembly Member Jackie Irwin was passed. This new law required all community colleges to use high school records to place students in English and math courses. And while the legislature thinks the world changes when a bill passes, trust me, I worked there for a while, the reality is the real work happens at the campus level. Assessment in places changing is happening as we speak. The bill mandated placement changes beginning in 2019. And while there were early adopters to the change, the vast majority of campuses are in the midst of implementation now. As with all significant policy changes, particularly in the largest system of higher education in the nation, with 73 districts and 115 campuses, this process is, to say, at the very least, daunting. We want to thank the Chancellor's Office for access to the necessary data for this and our earlier reports. We are grateful to the campuses that worked with our researchers, and we are particularly grateful with the faculty and the Faculty Association for their engagement. This dialogue informed our work, and as we hope, our work will inform implementation at the local level. I'd now like to introduce a PPIC researcher, Marisol. Her recent projects have focused on developmental education, workforce skills gap, online learning in community colleges, and economic returns to college education. Please help me in welcoming Marisol.
Thank you, Deborah, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone here today, and also everybody watching us online. I want to say that in the next 15 minutes, I'm only going to give you a little taste of the results that you will find in the report and in the technical appendices, where you will find more detailed information about our data and our methods. For this presentation, really, I have two goals in mind. The first goal that I have in mind is I want to give you a sense of where the system was 1 year before full implementation of AB 705. And the second goal that that I have is show you some of our research findings that hopefully give colleges some reassurance that the potential benefits of implementing these reforms are real and are substantial. So with this in mind, let me start by just giving you a little bit of background. For those of, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with what is happening, the transition that is happening in the community colleges. But let me start by saying a study after a study have shown that remedial education was one of the biggest obstacles to a student completion in community colleges. And thankfully, with AB 705, we hope that we can fix this system-wide. And what AB 705 is intended to change fundamentally is the way in which colleges are placing their students in English and math courses. Basically, the system is moving away from the use of standardized placement systems to instead start using high school records for the placement of students. And as colleges start making these changes to be in compliance with AB 705, most colleges are also changing not only their placement structures, but also their delivery of remedial education. And they are doing so by moving away from traditional prerequisite remediation towards a concurrent model of support, especially or mostly in the form of co-requisite courses. And for all, those of you who are not familiar about co-requisite courses, in those models, basically the students receive the remedial support at the same time that they are taking the transfer level course. However, to be able to evaluate the impact that AB 705 is going to have on student outcomes is going to take some time until that data that will allow us to do that become available. Our motivation for doing this report was to really shed some light on the potential effects that we can see in community colleges after implementing these reforms. And we are using a group of colleges that significantly broader access to transfer level courses in the years leading up to the full implementation of AB 705. And as some of you might be aware, AB 705, even though is arguably the most important reform for remedial education, is not the first one. There was a lot of efforts that leading up to this big change. And so there was colleges that have been doing these changes since long time before AB 705 was a reality. So we want to learn from that colleges and see. And of course, we're saying the potential changes because we are moving from a space of voluntary pockets of reform that they were college lead to a situation where these changes are mandated to all colleges. So we will see what happens, but we still believe that we can learn from the experience of these colleges. So let me start by showing you, in this figure, we can see the share of first-time English students starting directly in transfer level English. For the purposes of this study, we are using the introductory college composition because that is the course that is the general education requirement for both the associate degree and for transfer. So this is the share. So and also, I want to make sure that these cohorts of students are calculated based on the first year that a student took their first English course, which is not necessarily the first term where the student was enrolled in college. So we see in this figure clearly that really before 2016, we see little change in that measure of access. So there was really no much change, and there, on an average, about 38% of first-time English students starting directly in a college composition course. However, starting in 2016, even in 2015, we start seeing change happening. And that is consistent with the increased reach of institutions like the Multiple Measure Assessment Project, institutions like the California Acceleration Project, and among other institutions, but also is consistent with the availability of the Basic Skills Student Outcome Transformation Grant. So all of these efforts make this change happen and help colleges be aware of the importance of engaging placement reform. Now we see that between 2015 and 2018, there was an increase of 30 percentage points in access to college composition. And half of that increase really happened in 2018. So as we got, as AB 705 became effective and colleges were aware of that, so that really accelerated significantly the pace of change. But now the question is, okay, this is in English, what happened in math? And in math, we see there was also a change. So we compare 2015 versus 2018. We see an increase of 17 percentage points in the share of students starting directly in a transfer level math course. Also, most of those 17 percentage points, 10 percentage points happened in 2018. So when you see this figure, I'm sure most of you can be, So when you see this figure, most of you can, a question that might be reasonable to ask is, why in English we are in 68% of students accessing transfer level, while in math we only have 43% of students? And we have few reasons why that's the case. First and foremost, we see that colleges have been more engaged to doing these changes, placement and curricular changes in English than in math. And that is, there is a reason why arguably it's more complicated to do these changes in math than in English, because you need to care about different programs of study, different courses, designing co-requisite for tailored to different programs of study. So that's one reason. The second reason, everything else equal, we will expect to always see the share of first-time English students going directly to transfer level English be higher than the one in math, is because of intermediate algebra. Intermediate algebra is a college-level course that satisfies the general education requirement for the associate degree, but is not a transferable course. So we are not including intermediate algebra for our calculation of throughput. So that's why we want to make this clarification. That's why everything equal, that share is going to be lower, because we are including in our universe of students that they were good with only just taking intermediate algebra. So now, that was what we see system-wide. However, system-wide figures mask important variation across colleges. And here we have the distribution of colleges across the different shares of access to transfer level courses. And there are two things that I want to highlight. First, in English, there was a dramatic change. And then, we're looking, those numbers that we're looking at number of colleges in each one of those access bands. So the situation, the distribution in 2018 is dramatically different to what we have back in 2015. For example, in 2018, we have 30 colleges where at least 80% of their first-time English students started directly in college composition. If I tell you 6 of those colleges, they have more than 90% of students, the vast majority of students starting in transfer level courses. That was not the case in any college in the system back in 2015. So this is a dramatic change, and we expect that what we see in those 30 colleges is going to be what is going to happen in the post-AB 705 era. We expect most colleges, we have another, next year when we have another year of data, we expect that most colleges are going to be in that above 80% access band. In math, I really like to have these two figures side by side, because really what it shows you is that there has been progress in both, but in most colleges, they were more far along in terms of changes in English than in math. And of course, there was a big change in math too. We went from 95 colleges where less than 40% of students had access to transfer level math to now 47 colleges, but still that's a very big number. Still, that's a very big number. Okay, so that's what we want to show for this. Now, really, increases in access are only important if they translate in increases in successful completions. You can have a lot of access, and but that per se is not a good policy, because you need those students to really complete this important milestone. So in this figure, I want to walk you through this figure, but there is a lot of information here. So in the horizontal axis, we have the change in the share of first-time English students enrolling directly in college composition, and that changes over the 2015-2018 period, and that's our measure of increasing access. Then in the vertical axis, we have the change in the one-term throughput rate. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, throughput rate gives you the share of an entering cohort that successfully completed the college composition course within a period. And in this case, we are looking at one-term throughput rate. And in AB 705, I think the indicator that is going to be used is going to be the one-year throughput rate. However, the reason why we are using one-term throughput rate is because we wanted to be able to use the 2018 cohort, and we saw because that's when the big change happened, so we couldn't leave that out, so that's why we are using one-term throughput rate. And each dot in this scatter plot is one of the 114 community colleges in the system. So this is to say that we are using student-level data from all the students in all the colleges in the system to do our research. And now what I want to highlight about this figure is if you see in this upper panel, we have the colleges that had the biggest increases in access. So all these colleges are above, past the 35 percentage point increase in access between 2015 and 2016. And what we love about this, what we think that this figure is so telling is because all those colleges, with the exception of one college, all those colleges saw very, very big increases in throughput. I mean, an increase in throughput of above 25 percentage points, that's huge. We don't see that. We never saw that before. We didn't see that before, all this change happening. But still, as you can see, there is a still variation. You know, there is not like exactly a one-to-one, but it is. I think the main takeaway is that there is a strong, positive relationship between increases in access and increases in successful completion, and this is a very positive result. Now, another positive result is like students from all racial and ethnic groups benefit from these changes. So we see increases in throughput in between. So there is a lot of information that I'm going to unpack from this slide. First, we have two group of colleges. So our 109 colleges in our sample of colleges, we divided in two groups. Colleges that significantly broadened access to transfer level English, and then colleges, the rest of the colleges. And our measure of how we identify those colleges that significantly broadened access. So we use objective criteria. So we use across all colleges. We identify the colleges that saw an increase of 25 percentage points or more in the share of first-time students going directly into college composition in 1 year. So 1 year, that is a huge change. So that means that that college will be moving from, let's say, 20% access to 45% access. So that's a very big. So we identify all those colleges that saw in a year that change. But also that group of colleges, which is 39 colleges, that also includes a group of colleges that we say, well, you know, maybe you didn't do the big change all in 1 year, but then you work really hard and the college did, you know, an increase of 10 percentage points in 2016, another 10% in 2017, and so on. So if you got a cumulative growth of 35 percentage points or more, you are also included in our group of colleges that significantly broadened access. Okay, so that's kind of the explanation of who is in this figure and how we divide the colleges. And of course, I encourage everybody to just look at our data and for a more formal explanation. So there are many things we want to highlight. In all colleges, everybody saw increases in access. So that's just, there was a generalized trend towards increased access. So we see that. A second thing that I want to highlight is that increases between 2015 and 2018 for each racial and ethnic group, the increases in access were more than double the size in the colleges that significantly broaden access relative to the rest of the colleges. Okay, everybody saw increases in access, but in the colleges that significantly broadened access, the increases in throughput was more than double that in the rest of the colleges. So this is a very important result. And also, another thing that we want to highlight finally is that if you look at the baseline year, which is 2015, in the colleges that significantly broadened access, those colleges actually had lower throughput rates in the baseline year. So because we have here this argument saying like, you are saying that, but you are picking up the colleges that are the best performing colleges, the colleges that have the best population, and really that's not the case. What we are showing is that group of colleges that significantly broader access is a very heterogeneous group. We have high performers, we have not so good performers, we have rural colleges, urban colleges, big colleges, little colleges. So it is a very heterogeneous group. So now, the relationship between increases in access and increases in throughput is mediated by multiple factors. So we have, for example, the availability of concurrent support different to co-requisite remediation. If they have, other ways to support their students, all that is included in that relationship, but might be affecting that relationship that we see between increases in access and increases in throughput. We want to focus in the effect of co-requisite courses may have in that relationship. So for that, we just use a subset of colleges. So we are just focusing here in the group of colleges that saw the big jump in access in 2018. So we have 19 colleges in that category. And what is interesting is, so those colleges saw their big increase of access, more than 25 percentage points between 2017 and 2018. They have that big jump. Of those colleges, 10 colleges offered co-requisite support at the same time that they expanded access. 9 colleges open access without implementing the concurrent support, and maybe the reason why was because they were still in the process of planning their co-requisites and all of that. But what we want to highlight from this figure is between 2015 and 2017, those colleges look pretty much the same. The colleges that actually offer co-requisite, they have a slightly lower throughput rates than the colleges that did not offer co-requisites. But in 2018, when the big change in access happened, we see that college ended up with a 10 percentage point difference in throughput rate. So the colleges that offer co-requisite had a throughput rate that was, on average, that was 10 percentage point higher than the average for the colleges that did not offer co-requisite. So this provides some evidence that the importance of having these two reforms happening at the same time. You have placement reform, but at the same time, you are not just giving access, but also providing the support that the students need to be able to be successful. And then also, I want to just very briefly tell you about our findings in terms of co-requisite courses. So we found that in 2018, there were 36 colleges in the system already offering co-requisite courses for college composition. And colleges started to implement co-requisite courses back in 2016. There was 10 colleges and about 2,000 students, and the growth has been very impressive. By 2018, there were about 15,000 students enrolling in these co-requisite courses. One thing that we want to highlight, of those 36 colleges that offered co-requisite support in 2018, there was a lot of different ways in which colleges structured those courses. There was different types. They also implemented the co-requisites in different scales. So we have colleges that started as a pilot, other colleges started full size and eliminated most of the remedial education offerings. So there was a lot of variation, and we hope that we can hear more about this during our panel discussion about this variation. And finally, an important question is we are seeing all this growth in the in offerings for co-requisite courses. So how are students performing in those courses? And the answer is that it is remarkable the one-term throughput rate that we see from co-requisite remediation. And we have seen that before in our previous research, but I mean, it is just astonishing to see that these throughput rates, and especially it is really remarkable once you compare these throughput rates relative to the throughput rates of students that are starting in developmental education. So in this figure, we are comparing the one-term throughput rate for co-requisite students versus the 1 year throughput rate for students who started in developmental education. So we are giving them kind of the time to complete remediation and the transfer level course. And there, in all colleges, of those colleges that we look at, the one-term throughput rate from co-requisite was significantly higher than the 1 year throughput rate from students starting in developmental education. In most of the cases, that difference was above 30 percentage points. And also the other piece of good news is that we see that gains of co-requisite remediation across all race and ethnicities. So we're very excited about these results, and we offer in the report some thoughts about what should we be thinking about moving forward. So first and foremost, I think equity should be at the heart of the reforms, because we are seeing very big increases in successful completion among all students from all race ethnicities. However, our research didn't find that there was a dramatic change in achievement gaps. Everybody's doing better, which is good, but now I think we need to be intentional about how we really work on those and reducing those achievement gaps. Second, more research is needed about identifying effective co-requisites models. So we saw that there was a huge variation, so we need to really understand if there is one model that works better than the other model, or what we can learn from this implementation. Also, struggling students may need additional support beyond the co-requisite courses, so they might need both academically and non-academically additional support. And finally, ongoing support for colleges, transparency, accountability, and evaluation are going to be key. We like to say that AB 705 is not the end of the road. Colleges are doing, this is a very, very dramatic change, and we believe that colleges should evaluate their numbers and see what is happening and fine-tune their changes based on what they are learning their student outcomes are. So this should be a continuous process. And with this, I end my presentation. Thank you very much for your time, and I want to invite my colleague Hans Johnson and our distinguished panel for what is said to be a very engaged discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Marisol. My name is Hans Johnson. I direct the Higher Education Center at PPIC. And I am really pleased to introduce our panel of experts who will be talking about these changes and what's happening at the colleges right now. On your far left, we have John Stanskas. John is president of the Academic Senate of the California Community Colleges. Next to him is Laura Metune, who is vice chancellor of external relations for the California Community College Chancellor's Office. And then closest to me, we have President Julianna Barnes from Cuyamaca College, which is a community college in San Diego County. So thank you for being here. What I'd like to start off with, as Marisol mentioned, these changes are happening in real time right now across all 114 colleges in the system. And I'm wondering if each one of you could reflect on what you're hearing about what's happening in the colleges and how they are adjusting to this new paradigm. And anyone could start?
Do I have to? No. I can. So how are colleges adjusting to the new paradigm? I think that we've spent a lot of time educating colleges about what's expected of them. I think that right now, I really appreciated the opening remarks where we talked about how when legislation is introduced and it seems like, well, this should happen next week. And then we think about 114 bureaucracies trying to adjust and make changes. And happening in 2 years is really fast. for a college to engage in the dialogue. And I think there were a lot of messages that were out there that were a little unclear. So colleges were unsure what to do and how to do that. So I think we've done a really good job with the messaging that, here's the intent of AB 705. We know placement tests, as we have used them in the past, are discriminatory based on race and gender, and we should stop using them. That we need to evaluate placement through a lens of student capacity as opposed to what students can prove they know how to do, which is a shift in how that kind of placement has been done in the past. And we need to examine the concept of throughput, not just course completion. And so those are the three things that we've been trying to message to colleges about where they need to go and how to evaluate where they are. And I think something that's, an early success is everyone has a plan in the colleges, and they have created something that they are trying. And so the fact that we have 114 colleges all trying something is fantastic.
Laura?
Sure. I started with the Chancellor's office just a few months before AB 705 was introduced. And one of my first experiences on this issue was being called forward in a Senate Education Committee hearing, and the chair of that committee really wanting to know why it is they've been talking about basic skills reform for 15 years, and we haven't seen any change across our system. And I think it was really that hearing and our inability to articulate a reasonable response to that question that resulted in AB 705 passing. I think colleges run the gamut in how they're responding to this. Some colleges will come up to me and say, thank you so much for this legislation that is driving the change we knew should have existed 15 years ago. And other colleges will come up and say, this is really hard. We have a reading department. We're not sure how to navigate this, these separate requirements. Our math department's tried different things. None of them have worked. We all care about students. What do you want us to do? So I think it really just depends on where you're sitting in this huge reform across our system. I do want to call out specifically the work of the Academic Senate and my colleagues in the Chancellor's office to try and come together and bridge that divide across the perspectives on this issue and give some clear guidance and directive and support to colleges as they work through this. And then the other thing I want to say is that I am so glad the legislature did this in a bit of a piecemeal approach. Before we saw AB 705, we saw 2 years where $90 million was put into the community college system to help colleges experiment in this space. And so we had 64 different colleges who tried different things to help students excel through or bypass remedial education in its traditional form. And because of that, we have a lot more information now about what works and what doesn't work. And so as the rest of our colleges come forward to experiment and try new things, we can do a really good job of helping them understand what we already know doesn't work and where we think there's promise and where there's room for new experimentation. Thanks.
And President Barnes, your college, I don't know if any of you remember, but that was one of the dots at the far top right of the scatter plot. And so your college that had been implementing some of these changes early on, you do have AB 705 in full implementation mode now. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your college's experience as well as what you might have heard from some of your other neighboring colleges or how you might be sharing what you've done at your college with other colleges in the system.
Sure. As mentioned, Cuyamaca College, we were early adopters with regard to developmental education reform. I had the honor and privilege of stepping in as college president in 2015, and one of my very first meetings was with my math faculty, and they wanted me to read a report on how we wanted to reform developmental education. And interestingly, it was a beautiful kind of union with the math faculty and myself with regard to my prior research, which focused on developmental education. So when the faculty came forward and said, we want to completely transform what we're doing, I said, yes, we're going to do this. So that's a beautiful position to be in. So we went all in with our developmental education reform in math in 2016, and then all in English in 2018. We kind of dabbled with that reform reform prior to that, but went all in with the use of multiple measures and the co-requisite model in both math and English. And as you saw from the data, we've seen some beautiful increases in access and in throughput, as was mentioned. Just to say, throw out a couple numbers, in English in a 3-year period, we went from 31% of students accessing transfer level English to 88%. And in math, we went from 26%. In the first year, we went to 57%, and after 3 years, 78% accessing transfer level, which is monumental. And the other thing I want to say, and this is true for my own college, but I think other colleges as well, regardless of where you are and where the sentiments are with AB 705 and with this reform, we cannot deny the data and what we're seeing and what we've seen in other states as well. And the way I kind of want to ground what I want to share is looking at this from an equity lens. This is absolutely an equity imperative. When we dug into our own data at Cuyamaca, just like many of the other community colleges are doing, we saw some distinct gaps in equity with our African American and our Latinx students. So we knew that in looking at our basic skills data, that there was something that we needed to do, and we needed to do it quickly, and we needed to do it dramatically. So we really grounded this work from an equity lens, and when you consider, that data and what was happening before, again, this was absolutely an equity imperative for us.
I want to say that about a year after AB 705 passed, I had the opportunity to bring a number of legislative staff down to Cuyamaca and talk to students and math faculty. And people were in tears talking about the transition they'd made in their own philosophy about these issues and the impact that it had on students. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's exciting. So thinking about this now, again, as it's being rolled out throughout the system, what are some ways that we, meaning the chancellor's office, the colleges, the academic senate, can help colleges who might be struggling or might be having a hard time finding the right faculty to teach the right courses? And what are some of the things that can be done to improve the outcomes of the colleges that aren't the Cuyamacas in the system?
Do I have to go first every time?
No, you do not.
Okay. That's fine.
I would just, I would say one of the key components is the research and analysis that's happened on this issue. We're lucky to have had the multiple measures assessment pilot that helped us look at data and understand the implications of certain changes. We now have a report from the Campaign for College Opportunity, the RP group, which is sort of an internal community college research organization. PPIC has written on this numerous times. And so part of what we've tried to do is distribute that information across the colleges at the various levels. Obviously, this change affects you whether you're a faculty member on the front lines of teaching students, to an assessment officer, to a student leader and trustee who's trying to provide oversight and accountability to the system. And so we've tried to disseminate information. We've partnered with the Academic Senate on a series of trainings across the system. We have other organizations that are also conducting professional development and training, the California Acceleration Project. Next week, the Association of Community College Trustees is meeting in the Bay Area. They'll be talking about the role of trustees in oversight in this arena. Student Senate leaders, I specifically want to call out students making a change at San Francisco City College who've worked to educate other students about their rights to access transfer level math and English. So I think at this point, the Chancellor's Office is trying to support a variety of ways to educate folks on what the requirements are, what the research says, and help students understand how to access the courses they're entitled to access.
So, so there's a lot of things to think about as what are the challenges that are emerging recently. Yesterday, I was at an event that was co-sponsored by the Chancellor's Office, the Academic Senate, the RP Group, and the 3CSN to help regionally colleges come together and talk about their implementation of AB 705 and where to go next. I think that colleges worked really hard to comply with a deadline. And compliance is rough and uneven and is not very student-centered. It's actually compliance-driven. And part of our effort was to tell colleges, you're compliant now, but now let's get down to being more nuanced about who our students are and what they need from us to be successful. Right now, I think it's 59% of the colleges are implementing the default placement rules that the Chancellor's Office and the Academic Senate wrote into some guidance right now. The default placement rules are actually a little different than the MMAP data that we saw being implemented in 2018 and 2017, and they were, if you can't think of what else to do, do this. And so to comply, many colleges chose to do that. And now they need to go back and tailor that a little more specifically for their colleges. They need to look at what does that co-requisite really look like? What does it mean? What evidence can we provide them for what might be helpful in that? And that's what we've been trying to collect that. And so we've been trying to tell colleges that it is okay, that this is not perfect, that we've made that initial change I spoke about a couple minutes ago, and now let's continue to refine this every year to serve our students. And that's what we need to do, and that's what we should be doing every year as we evaluate our programs. And I think that's what we see from colleges who were early adopters, is a constant evaluation and improvement of their service to their population. And so I think that's pretty important. The other part that needs to happen is we have a difficult time with coding because we didn't have a way to track in our statewide systems what a co-requisite did exactly in the way that we're using co-requisite support now. And so if you look at some colleges, everything that's listed as a co-requisite for transfer level work is listed as basic skills. So if you just go through and count how many basic skills classes they're offering, it looks like they're offering a lot, but they're not offered independently. They're linked to a co-requisite to the transfer level. And so cleaning up that data with colleges is something that's a technical assistance the Chancellor's Office can help with through directives in that way, and that the Academic Senate can help with. And I think that the last thing that is very helpful for college leadership to do, and one of the themes I heard yesterday from the attendees at this regional meeting in the Inland Empire, is now that we're compliant and we're not worried about being out of compliance, we actually need to sit down as an institution and make some space for dialogue that has data and really chew on what does this data mean and how can we make this better for our students. And I think that's one of the things that I really commend President Barnes, because she made that space for her college to come together and said, this is a priority and this is what we need to look through, and had the space for the dialogue so that change could be implemented and perfected.
So can you talk a little bit more about how you did that? You alluded to, what the environment was like when you came to Cuyamaca, but how have you moved forward since then in terms of creating this kind of environment? The receptivity of faculty, the changes in schedule, everything, including, how do students report their high school grades to you? And are there ways that could be made more seamless, for example, by having longitudinal data connected with the high schools?
Right. So it was one thing to make the commitment to do this work, and it was another thing to actually implement it, because it takes a village, truly. We needed to be sure that we were working with our high school partners so that they understood, what the changes were, our perspective and our current students as well, our entire college community. And it requires the collaboration with your technology arm, your student services side of the house, your instructional side of the house. So it takes the entire village. And so we realized that early on that this was a loaded effort, but again, an important effort. And so we were eventually able to get all of those pieces working in harmony with one another to actually move forward. We had to kind of reprogram our system to ask particular questions, to get at the multiple measures. And so, that programming in and of itself, that technology piece, was a significant part of what we needed to do moving forward. I'm very proud of Cuyamaca. Like many of the colleges, just the spirit of innovation and that we can do this on behalf of our students, that persists, and we need to continue to do that moving forward. As far as like supports to the field, what's a beautiful thing about the California community colleges is that we love to collaborate and we love to borrow ideas from one another. I know we're not shy about doing that. We learned about a lot of the high impact practices happening in other states with regard to developmental education reform, and we were able to adopt some of those. We learned from the variety of kind of research from the MMAP, from CAP, from PPIC, and from other research bodies. We were able to learn from the best and employ that. And we are also open, and we have been able to give back and share with the college system as well. In fact, we have my faculty reminded me that we actually have an open house at Cuyamaca next week where we invite the California community colleges to come check out what we're doing, very much like we had visitors from the state chancellor's office come and visit us, where we open our doors, we open up our curriculum so that we could share, kind of the joy of what we're doing with others, and for you to be able to borrow the pedagogy and the changes that we've made in your own institutions.
So we have now a lot more students who will be starting directly in college level courses in English and math. Before we turn to some of the questions about math that were raised, I think, in the presentation that Marisol gave, I'd first like to focus on co-requisites and other concurrent supports that you've observed colleges implementing or that your own college has implemented. And what kind of guidance do colleges need or not in identifying what's the best way to design those co-requisites? What's the role of the chancellor's office? What's the evidence from colleges like Cuyamaca that have been doing this? John, what have you heard from different colleges that are doing different kinds of co-requisites or other concurrent supports? Because as we all know, we're taking some students, some of whom probably did not really need remediation in the past, now placing them directly in college level courses, and some of them won't even be in co-requisites because they did very well in high school, for example, in English or math, and don't need those. But a lot will need some sort of additional support. And again, we highlighted how important co-requisites were, but of our big implementer colleges in 2018, only a little over half were actually using co-requisites for that first cohort at least.
Looks like it's my turn to go first. So
there you go.
So Cuyamaca does use the co-requisite model in both English and in math. And so basically what that means is we provide the college level content with concurrent support. And what we do is we add additional units to either that math or that English course. The same faculty member teaches the college content and provides the academic support. And so there's kind of the just-in-time academic support, or some people call that just-in-time remediation, that's happening kind of seamlessly within the course. And so as you've seen from the report, we've seen some really great results in terms of throughput with successful course completion in both math and English using this model. However, what we talk about at Cuyamaca is that change in practice and structure is not enough. We also need to focus on the practitioner. So practice is important, but so is the importance of nurturing and providing that professional development to the practitioner, namely the faculty member teaching, both full-time and part-time. So we've provided a lot of support to our faculty through communities of practice and through a variety of other professional development opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit more later about our equity-minded teaching and learning institute that we have at our college. But so it's very important, again, to have that structure. But then once the students are in the class with that structure, what does teaching look like in the classroom? What does a student-centered classroom look like? And if you visit Cuyamaca College, you'll see I think a lot of colleges are doing this now. So the way you see it is you see groups of students working together, having a lot of peer-to-peer interaction. You see the faculty member not necessarily at the front of the classroom, but moving throughout the classroom. And so there's a lot of peer-to-peer interaction. So there's this very student-centered, collaborative learning environment within that co-requisite structure. In addition, there's a lot of focus on the affective domain. We've heard a lot about the affective domain. And I think, John, you talked a little bit about that, really believing in student capacity, really getting in tune to the ways, what the student attitudes are in class, what their sentiments are, creating that sense of belonging, understanding when you see kind of fear, particularly in math and that kind of thing, and how do you help students kind of productively work through that struggle in math. So really paying attention to that affective domain as well. And then the other thing I want to say is, once we open up transfer level math and English to all, you see a difference in your class. And I know our faculty really noted this before, and again, you just look at the data and you saw who was accessing transfer level math and English, and it was not our students of color. We did not see our students of color accessing transfer level math and English. You now see the diversity that's reflective of our community colleges in the transfer level math and English. So that has implications for the way we teach and the way students learn with one another in the classroom. So again, implications for equity-minded teaching and pedagogy in the classroom with this new model as well, and implications for the practitioner with professional development as well.
So I wanted to back up just a little bit, because I think part of this conversation about co-requisites goes back to the guidance that was issued by the chancellor's office and the default placement rules. And so essentially these rules were developed using data available from the multiple measures assessment pilot, trying to respond to the directive that was provided in AB 705. And the directive was essentially that we not require students to take unnecessary remedial education, and that we maximize their ability to get through transfer level math and English within a year. And so we looked at data and determined what were students' chances based on their high school GPAs of achieving that 1 year throughput, whether they just went directly into transfer level, whether they went one level below transfer level, or whether they went into transfer level with support such as a co-requisite. And so, for example, what we found in English was that if you're a student that graduated high school with less than a 1.9 GPA, if you start one level below transfer level English, you have a 12% chance of getting through transfer level English. If you enroll directly into transfer level English, you have a 43% chance of getting through transfer level English. And if you enroll into that transfer level English with co-requisite support, you have a 45% chance. We're talking about that same group of students with lower than a 1.9 cumulative GPA. And so we used that information, looked at different GPA bands, and provided guidance in these default placement rules to colleges. And what we said was, for those students in that lowest band, in that 1.9 GPA band, you should absolutely provide those students co-requisite support. Colleges ultimately decide what that looks like, but we're recommending that they provide that to students. For students whose GPA is for English, for example, for students whose GPA is in that middle band, that sort of 2.0 to 3.0, 2.5, 2.59, we're saying colleges can decide whether or not a co-requisite support is appropriate for that student or not. Right now, what we know is a student with between a 1.9 and 2.59 GPA enrolling into transfer level English has a 58% chance of passing transfer level English and a 79% chance of passing if they have that co-requisite support. So the college can decide what's appropriate there. For those students with that highest level GPA, in English we set that at 2.6 in our default placement rules for English. It's 3.0 for statistics. It's a little 3.2, I think, for STEM-focused math majors. We're saying allow those students directly into transfer level. No need to provide them co-requisite support. Certainly, if the student chooses to access those, they're welcome to. So that's sort of the way in which we set up our default placement rules. And what we've said to colleges is absolutely experiment in this place and try and beat that. We encourage you and support you in trying to do better than that. And we think there are absolutely ways to do that. Don't do worse, right? This is the default because this is what we can get based on statewide data. Don't experiment in ways that do worse for our students. Okay, so all that is just to get to this issue of co-requisites, where I wanted to say the complexity of our system is evidenced here more than anywhere else. You know, you look at the same math class at one college and another college, and they're completely different unit loads. And so when you try and add a co-requisite on top of a math class that might be 5 units at one school and 3 units at another school, that's going to look different. And who's best to make some of those distinctions, and when it's appropriate, what it looks like, what is absolutely essential for the next class in that sequence, that we think it's the college and that faculty working together to figure that out. So what we've tried to do is create a framework where those conversations can happen. And to the degree that regulations and statute get in the way from those types of conversations and actions, we've tried to address that. One example that comes up is the issue of supervised tutoring. It used to be that a college could only claim apportionment, their primary way of getting paid, essentially, for students who took supervised tutoring if that student was enrolled in basic skills, right? So you have to go into basic skills in order to get access to the tutoring. That completely doesn't work if we're trying to tell colleges to enroll students in transfer level. So that's something we were able to solve at the chancellor's office. We sent out new guidance, told the colleges that they could claim apportionment for students that were enrolling directly into those transfer level gateway courses if they also needed supervised tutoring. It's just one small example of the ways in which I think the chancellor's office can support this. But I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about all the other ways.
So I think that the conversations that the Chancellor's Office and the Academic Senate had around the MMAP study was that this is the best information we have at the time. That this information is based on a subset of students, not entire college adoption, that had met specific requirements. And so to the best of our ability, this is what we think. We also completely told the colleges to experiment and let us know how to do it better. That it is okay to come up with your own plan and share it with everyone. That direct placement in transfer level math is a challenge specifically because of the 2 tracks that exist, depending upon what the student's goal is. And then you have another track if the student is not interested in transfer, but just wants to earn an associate's degree, in welding, and they will make more money than me. So that's the sort of challenge with mathematics. But when you're designing programs like that, and you think about how do we empower the student to make an informed choice about what are their goals, how does the college know what their goals are to help them get there, and where can they go? So our co-requisite models, you're right, some of them, if you have 7 units of transfer level math in one term, that may not serve all students. It might serve lots of students, but it might not serve all of them. And the student needs to have some agency in that decision. Is what needs to happen. I think right now in implementation about co-requisites, the main difference, because we're all implementing, well, 2/3 are implementing a sort of rough, hard, here are the default rules, that those co-requisites, the main decision right now is, are they optional or required? And then the other decision that colleges are making are they full-term co-requisites, or are they late start co-requisites? Do they start right after the first assessment where students can gauge, I need more help with this or not, and how is that going? And I think we're seeing some early data from colleges about they're making some decisions about that. Number one, if the student needs a co-requisite, you probably have to make it required. But you have to figure out who needs it and who doesn't. And that's the part that I think colleges are working through right now. I really believe that we are engaged in a giant social experiment. I don't see that it's going to, on the whole, harm a majority of our students. That it will actually help many students. It's not going to help all students, and we need to collect that data from this year. I'm really glad you said that we're going to look at this again next fall, because what we need to do is look at what did we implement, and then what can we learn from that at large scale, and then how can we share that information among the field so that we can learn from each other. So I I tell everyone who asks about 705, I'm like, this is great. Those points of what the purpose is are true. I don't know people who want to argue about that. How we are going to figure out how to implement that is going to take a little time. And we're going to have to work through it, and we're going to have to collect data, and we're going to have to keep looking at it. And so having PPIC have a baseline of here's what we know prior to fall 19 is really helpful so that we can see what happened next year this time with fall 19 data.
And we're excited to continue to do that work, and we appreciate the partnership of the colleges and the faculty and the chancellor's office in helping us accomplish those goals. I do want to quickly touch on math in particular, and I would say, you know, we as a team at PPIC, when we look at the changes, you saw them, thought there's going to be more challenges in math than in English. That was borne out by the data. It was borne out by our discussions with campus leaders, including faculty and administrators. And yet at Cuyamaca, it seems that maybe, I don't want to say you've solved math, but you're further down the road. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, President Barnes.
Sure. So as mentioned earlier, we've been at this for a number of years, and we've been in this modality of continuous improvement and looking at our data, making improvements, and then looking at it again. And so this cycle of continuous improvement. But one of the things that has really been consistent, and it's actually a couple things, and I alluded to it earlier about really honing in on this affective domain. Again, there's the structural part of it with the multiple measures, the co-requisite support, but again, that affective domain has also been a really big part of what we've done in the co-rec model, and even in the traditional transfer level courses as well. Coupled with that, as mentioned, the diversity in our courses now are such that they mirror the diversity of our colleges, and so we're seeing this again, this beautiful diversity in the classroom that we hadn't seen before in the transfer level classes, which again has implications for employing an equity-minded approach in the classroom. And so one of the things that we employed at Cuyamaca College is what we're calling the Equity-Minded Teaching and Learning Institute. We've had close to 100 faculty members, both full-time and part-time, who have participated in the Equity-Minded Teaching Institute. And basically what that's about is making equity personal. A lot of times when you see these big numbers in the aggregate, it's hard to make a connection. Oh, okay, there's equity gaps. Okay, not all students are completing, and you see disproportionate impact for Latinx and African American students, but it's hard to make the connection in the classroom. And so what we've done is we provide course level data to our math and English faculty that's disaggregated, and we help them to analyze that data, and we help them to establish, what's the story there? And we help them to establish goals to mitigate that disproportionate impact, coupled with training in culturally relevant curriculum and pedagogy. And then our faculty then set goals to make some improvements as it relates to the closing of those equity gaps. In math, as was noted, we've seen a beautiful closing in equity gaps, but we still have a ways to go, and this is the same with English. And so moving forward, we're going to continue on with this focus on equity-minded teaching in the classroom.
And Laura, John, do you have any comments either on helping to narrow the equity gaps, and then specifically where math seems to be the bigger challenge?
So the Academic Senate for the last 2 years has really highlighted, as elevated the goal of equity. We focus on faculty diversification, but along with faculty diversification is providing a framework in which college faculty leaders can talk about what it means to have an equity-minded institution, what it means to look at disaggregated data meaningfully, and how to impact change with that. And so that is a long-term sort of cultural shift that we're asking colleges to come along with us with. And I think that is important. That doesn't answer the distinct question about mathematics. I think math will continue to be a challenge for lots of reasons. we have a shortage of teachers in K-12 who are qualified to teach math. That is a statewide issue in the high schools. We require to go to one of the four-year colleges that do have admission requirements, 3 years of math, and less to graduate. And so if you think about anything that you've done or learned, and then you just don't think about it for a year or two, or 3 or 5, and then someone says, oh yeah, you learned that once. How does that work again? I don't quite remember. And so somehow figuring out how to incorporate that across the curriculum so that it isn't lost in some way, and evaluating how we are supporting math education the whole way through the educational system is going to be important. There are ways to do that. There are ways to make history classes, political science classes. I don't know if you all, I'm old, I guess, but I don't know if you remember writing across the curriculum. You can do quantitative reasoning across the curriculum the same way. That makes it much more real and relevant to the student and what they care about, because most students don't care about X. They care about distribution of populations in the Electoral College, right? That's X too. But making those connections are important.
The only thing I would add, I agree with both of my colleagues. I would just say that I think we have to take a real look at ourselves and issues of historic racism and implicit bias and lack of diversity. I mean, in the chancellor's office, in our faculty, in our leadership ranks, all of these places where these issues are possibly resulting in differences in outcomes for students. I worry a little bit. Sometimes I hear distinctions that are really synonymous with terms that we see as, having some historical racism connotations, whether it's talking about students from urban districts or other ways we talk about our students that are clearly disenfranchising a portion of our students that we should do a better job of reaching out to. I think what you talked about is exactly right, trying to work with your colleges, look at your data. If you find that there are specific high schools where students maybe aren't being provided the resources they need, what kind of dual enrollment programs and other outreach can help students in those circumstances. But I'm just really aware of the way in which we need to just be careful that it's not our own implicit bias that's resulting in these differences, and not some of the things that have been raised about lack of preparation or other issues.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thanks so much. I will note, too, when we've been talking about math, we're actually talking about math and statistics and quantitative reasoning more generally. When we looked at what colleges were doing in math that had implemented changes in assessment and placement, were offering co-requisite. It was most co-requisite courses. It was the most commonly statistics pathway with statistics co-requisites, just to be clear, which is kind of part of what you were alluding to, John, about what students might really care about rather than the cosine of X or, yeah. So in any event, I want to leave time for questions from the audience. So don't be shy, but please do wait for the microphone, because that way we'll be able to make sure that the people who are watching on the web are able to hear your question as well.
Actually, you kind of gave the preamble to my question, Hans. I'm just wondering, I know the report didn't get into breaking out statistics, co-recs, and STEM, but what are you seeing in terms of implementation of co-recs in statistics versus in STEM, and any differences in how those are being implemented and being successful?
I assume you mean across the state, yes. And I don't have the exact numbers for what has been implemented. I know that colleges are working on both co-requisite support. I do know that some colleges are experimenting with what's called a stretch course, especially in the B-STEM pathway. That seems to make more sense in terms of curricular design and offerings for some, but I don't know how prevalent that is. Just because I've heard of it and I know one person that's doing it doesn't mean that everybody is. Yes, and so some of the community colleges, I believe, are trying to model that behavior.
And John highlighted this issue earlier, but we should repeat it, that part of the challenge in looking at data across the system is that we haven't done a good job of coding co-requisites so that you can easily figure out which students are accessing a co-requisite and which aren't.
Right.
And that's something we're working on.
Hello. My question is more for Marisol. So the question that I had is, I know that we focused for, as you explained, specific reasons to want to see 2018 data. We looked at one-term throughput, but I'm curious to see what the one-year throughput, if there's data on that, as well as, eventually the retention rates of those areas, and also to see if there is data on average GPA and how folks performed in these even term-based throughput. I think for a lot of us, the data was absolutely amazing, and it showed a lot of improvement in access. But without knowing just how the level of mastery within these courses are, we won't be able to really tell how they will do in the subsequent years or when they transfer to the UC system or CSU.
Actually, I'm very happy you asked that question because we couldn't, there was a lot of results in the report that we couldn't go over, but actually we did look at how, specifically for English, how co-requisite students perform in the subsequent course. So in the critical thinking course, how they perform. And what we found was that students perform as well as students that came from the developmental education sequence. So there was not a statistically significant difference between the students that took the co-requisite and the students from developmental education. However, having said that, there was a big, we all know there was a big attrition problem from those who come to from developmental education. So those numbers, those students that take the critical thinking course that come from developmental education, that's a very curated sample of students. Those are kind of like the students that really powered through and were able to go through remediation, college composition, and went to. So that's very good. We're going to continue doing analysis on this, and we're going to start looking at the next step. Okay, did they pass the critical thinking course, but what about other courses? What about did they meet all the general education required at a higher rate that all the students that start in developmental education, GPA? Yeah, we're going to look at all of that. And in terms of your other part of your question about the one-term throughput rates, we did calculate those for the colleges that had a significant increase in 2016 and 17, and the increases are also remarkable. And we made those available upon request. So if you want, we can for sure provide that data. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Michael Wengler. I'm the Dean of Mathematics at Citrus College in LA County. And I just want to, I have a couple of things I want to speak to. One is to, thank all of you. I think what we're doing is an amazing accomplishment. It's so important, this work that we're doing to close equity gaps. And I want to thank Cuyamaca College in particular, because Citrus College largely adopted what Cuyamaca started. And one of the underlying tenets with scientific experimentation is, can you replicate it? And we have. Citrus College has replicated what Cuyamaca has done. And we have achieved, both in math and English, just incredible success in just 1 year. So, for example, our one-year throughput rate in English is 69%. That's just last year's one-year throughput rate, first year that we have the data. In math, the one-year throughput rate went from 18% 3 years ago to 45% this past year. That's overall. Yeah. But that was before we fully implemented AB 705, which was this semester. Our one-year throughput rate for statistics, which we did fully implement last year, that one-year throughput rate is 67%. And we expect, that's a predictor for where we expect the throughput rate to go across the board now that we have implemented a pathways placement model where all students have access to transfer level math, 5 choices, all UC, CSU transferable, most of them with co-requisite support modeled after what Cuyamaca did. So, you know, it's been great to work with Cuyamaca and to also be an early adopter and to see the successes. And I want to reiterate how important the effective domain piece of this is. There are some critical things that happened that made this successful. One is, you know, the curricular and structural changes, also the classroom changes. We completely gutted our math building, brought in new collaborative furniture, put whiteboards on all of the walls, following Cuyamaca's model, and extensive professional development. And I think really, I guess one thing I want to emphasize is that we talk a lot about believing in the capacity of our students, and that is absolutely critical. But as an administrator, I think it's just as important to believe in the capacity of our faculty. Believe in the capacity of our faculty to be innovative, creative, and to do the right thing for students. So creating that space was really important. And that was my job as the dean, was to create that space and really encourage that innovation. So I want to leave you with, I guess, one question, kind of a comment and question, which is, so we have been very successful at this. Cuyamaca has been very successful with this linked co-requisite model. But in order to implement this, it took a lot of time, effort, and money. Yep. So we were fortunate to have the Basic Skills Grant, the BSOC grant, and Cuyamaca as well. We leveraged that grant to implement. I speak at a lot of colleges, I go to conferences, and the number one question I get is, how did you pay for this? When we show them what we've done. And BSOC grant is expired, and I guess I want to know, are there going to be any other opportunities, a competitive grant of some kind, that would allow colleges that want to do this to be able to, because the other funds, the C program and other sources, guided pathways, that's some money, but it's not that one-time shot in the arm that these colleges really need to be able to implement, like Cuyamaca and Citrus were able to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll say I would love to see additional external dollars. So we did have the BSOC grant as well, and our grant did expire, but we absolutely made an institutional commitment to sustain the program. And our college knows this. It's one of our strategic priorities is developmental education reform. It's one of our funding priorities, and that this is communicated and articulated to the college community. There's buy-in for that. And so we've met with our math and English and our ESL faculty to talk about what does it take to sustain our efforts. And so we've actually earmarked the dollars. That means that there's other things that we can't fund. But again, this is an institutional priority. It's broadly communicated and articulated and supported financially. And as you mentioned, it takes a village, administration, our faculty, our staff, all facets of the college to make this happen. But yes, I would love to see external dollars as well, because I think not all colleges are going to have that capability of, to do that.
I'm so glad you asked that, because Hans's last question that he didn't get to was about moving forward and what's next and what do we need to do. And my response was about the fact that community colleges receive the lowest per student funding level of any system of education in this state. And yet we serve this population of students who wear their opportunity to attain higher education. And I think that the state really needs to evaluate whether or not the 11% of Prop 98 that community colleges are guaranteed every year in the state budget is sufficient. I would say it's completely inadequate for the work that we're trying to do. I think this is one of many examples that we could talk about where additional resources could really make or break college implementation in some of these statewide reforms. Our budget request that was just approved by the Board of Governors last month calls for fully funding our apportionment, including some specific targeted increase around student equity and achievement, inmate education, other areas where we think we can have dramatic difference in student performance. $60 million that focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion that we think could absolutely be a part of the professional development supports provided for AB 705 implementation. On top of the inadequacy of community college funding, I think we should talk about the fact that community college students also receive the least amount of support to help them afford their total cost of attendance. If you've seen me on a panel before, you've probably heard me say that it is more expensive for a low-income student to go to a California community college than it is for that same student to go to the University of California. Because while we see this big difference in tuition, we also see a huge difference in the amount of resources that are available to that student to pay for their textbooks, to help them pay their rent, to buy food so they can go to class without without being hungry. These are all key components to student success, and if the state wants these types of reforms to be successful, those are the major investments that will continue to need to happen.
We're doing closing.
I thought that was it. We were running short, so I was like.
That's good. We have one more very quick question, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you, Bill. Yeah. So, yeah, John, I'll give you a chance.
This is Jeff. 2008, going through your student success plan. My question is, by looking at it, I see 100,000 is what you talked about in 2008. Does that match up against all the percentages? Because nothing else than the 100,000, I guess it was freshman English students coming in, do you discuss in the way of numbers? The other part of it is single colleges versus your community colleges that are multi-planned in Los Angeles, here and in the Bay Area. Was there significant difference in either the success rate or the implementation?
So I think some of the things that I hear from faculty that I've been in front of many groups of faculty and talked about their concerns about implementing AB 705 at their colleges. And most of those concerns are rooted in a fear of not doing a good job with their students. That's where that concern is. And we put together a list of what are some things you should track to see how you're doing. Beyond throughput, beyond disaggregate your data by race and ethnicity and gender and look at those, but what else are you looking for? And some of the things that we came up with as the faculty are who's not present anymore on campus? Have we implemented something that is in and of itself a barrier to coming to college for our community or not? So how many students withdraw and we don't see them again? And can we track them? Can we reach out to them and find out why? What did they need to stay and be successful? And I think that our advice in these regional meetings and everywhere else is there are some really good things out there that we can learn, and we're all publicly funded institutions, so that case methodology of copy and steal everything is totally open, right? If Cuyamaca is doing it and you want to do it, take it. Go ahead. I'm like, it's fine to replicate that. But look at your community and look at your students and make sure you're doing what's in the best interest of your students. If your average age is 19 and almost all of your students come directly from high school, that may have different considerations or may not than if your average age is 29 and your students, a third of them do not have a high school diploma. We have colleges that meet both of those demographics. And how are we serving all of those students? And so looking for equity gaps, not only in success rates, because we want to know about that as well, and that needs to be addressed. And I think we spent a long time talking about really reshaping the framework of the college to be much more equity-minded. But also, who is absent from my community that should be here? And so those are some of the things that we are trying to move forward and empowering colleges that now that you've implemented something, to go back and refine. And maybe you refine every year for 5 years, and that's okay, right? And continue to learn and grow to make sure you're serving all of your students to the best of your ability.
Thanks very much. We are out of time. President Barnes, do you have any final comments? And Laura, you already had your final comment. I think you made a good plug for more funding. President Barnes, any final thoughts?
You know, I think the only one thing I want to say as we were talking today, I think this developmental education reform movement also just provides kind of a ray of hope that perhaps wasn't there regardless of where you are with the legislation. I think that there's enough data that we've seen, and the PPIC report is an indication of provided that data as well. There's so many students, as we know. We wake up every day and we go to the community college, and people often ask me, what does a college president do? Like, what do I do? And I just say generally, I make dreams come true. And this is exactly what's happening with developmental education reform. There have been thousands and thousands of people, students, particularly students of color, who have been placed, what I say misdirected, into developmental education using just faulty placement tools, and they've not been able to get out, and it's not been a fault of their own. And so this movement, regardless of where you are in your thinking or your implementation, really provides this ray of hope and some realistic positive outcomes in terms of access and success for our students. So I just kind of want to say that. I think it's a beautiful thing, and I'm looking forward to seeing more and more colleges move forward with the efforts.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking our panel.